Before I pass it on to Chief Justice to do a further introduction, Patrick has asked me to quickly go through this document, which was just emailed to you. It's about PL 93-638 compacting and lease management on the Navajo Nation. Just to let everybody know, the Navajo Nation presently uses the contract system. These are agreements where tribes take over specific federal programs, manage the systems, but must comply with federal regulations and reporting requirements. This is all that Navajo Nation uses at the moment and has rejected the second option, which is a more flexible arrangement where tribes negotiate broader authority to manage multiple programs or funds as a block grant. It gives tribes greater autonomy to allocate resources and set priorities with fewer federal restrictions as compared to contracts. So what we'd like to tell you is the ARPA funds now is subject to a lot of restrictive holds, which is why so much remains unspent. The benefits of compacts means that tribes can reallocate funds across programs to address urgent needs, shifting funds during a crisis, which, as we all know, ARPA was not able to do. Programs under compacts can also incorporate tribal traditions, languages, and values, which we don't see right now under PL 638 contracts. And with that, I'll pass it on to Chief Justice to continue the introduction. Thank you, Chief.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone who is on this meeting. We come through our work in grassroots in exploring the issues and the concerns that we and our people face. And our perspective has always been that the people themselves must be allowed to fully participate in the government that exists on the nation, whether that means amending statutory laws with regard to the Navajo government, or whether it's to reform or set in place new rules, a new philosophy to base our, it's not a new philosophy from the viewpoint of the people. It's whether to restore the philosophy of government as we were taught and as we understand it, which is different from what was imposed and what still operates on our nation. And in our work, in our discussions, we've been exploring how to achieve, how to advance this effort. And one of the thoughts has been, can the law of corporations out there in the Anglo world, how can that be used through adjustment? How can it be used? Can it be used? And it was intriguing to learn of efforts out there going on using the corporate entities to explore how we can achieve or better achieve a full participatory democracy that we all envision. Now, we started off early on with exploring the use of co-ops. And we visited a family up in Colorado in their use of the corporate entity. And we talked among ourselves as to the history that we have in our government. And those of us who participated or worked for the Navajo people and the Navajo government, we've seen the extensive use of the 638 laws in running programs, utilizing federal funding. And we learn that this basic distinction in corporate entities used under 638. One is the straight 638 contracting, where the functions that the federal government performs and carry out on the res can be contracted by Indian tribes. And we use that process extensively, and we still do. And there is another way of using 638, and that's through what's called compacting. And there was always a couple of questions that come up in reviewing the whole use of 638. One is the question, at least from my viewpoint, one is the question we ask ourselves. Why do we continue to use exclusively the 638 arrangement? Why do we do that? And it turns out the usual answer is because that's what started on the res. That's how it was introduced to the people. And we're just used to that. And then the question is, if the basic idea of 638 is to undertake programs run by the federal government, principally the BIA and IHS, through a contractual arrangement for a specific program, the question has always been if the idea behind 638 is that you undertake by contract these functions and your tribe will learn how to do that. You learn how to run a specific contractual responsibility. Then the idea is after you're comfortable, you could take on that function totally under the tribe and then go to another federal function using their limited funding. And why haven't we done that? Haven't we learned how to run these programs after all these years? Why don't we undertake new programs? Recognizing the limited funding that comes with it. Those are questions that come up. But the tribe has never undertaken at least recently, completely new functions. They stick to the old programs that we know of. Now, there's always been the opportunity, there's always been the alternative of using compacts. But that's never been undertaken by the tribe. I assume you all have ideas of why that is. But I think basically it's just to undertake compacting means a thorough discussion of a government-wide discussion of undertaking that concept, using that concept. And what would be the underlying notion of the tribe when it undertakes compacting? And the thing is, we knew, or we have known, other tribes have done it. But I've never, in my experience, seen a discussion with other tribes of their experience, what they have learned, and what they would think on other tribes undertaking this. We've never talked directly to other tribes, at least in my experience. So those alternatives are available. But there's a real, I think, prejudice against local people undertaking these contractual functions. And maybe it's just simply because those in power, government power, wish to retain that power and not have it distributed to other entities like the chapters. That's just a basic human trait, I think. Once you get power, you hang on to it and you develop, you engage in keeping that power and not redistributing it. That's one reason. But now, what I think of when we think of our experience is that the governments, the BIA and the Navajo government, just has not acknowledged that there's always been a desire of more government participation in the government, and which translates really into going back to family governance over local matters, over local land management. And because especially the elders, they know that that's how the traditional people, the elders, govern themselves is through family, through the matriarch. That's how things were done. And they continue to be done to a certain degree out in the local areas, but they're not being acknowledged. And that's what they've been wishing for all these years. That's why they've gotten politicians to at least consider that thought. They got the government to change a little bit. So they passed the Local Governance Act. to try to achieve more local participation. And they pass the Title I, the acknowledgement that there is the net fundamental law. We've done that. These are small steps. And that's where we're at the moment. And we now have our brother from up north, another Diné, to tell us of his experience, his thoughts about the use of 638. And as Josie mentioned, he has extensive experience of an extensive background in looking at the use of 638. And I'm sure he can explain his recommendations, but that's our principal item on today's agenda, to listen and then to ask questions so we can gather our thoughts on how shall we proceed from here on out. So I would leave it to Josie and the guests to proceed. Thank you.
Patrick, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josie, and thank you, Chief, for that explanation. One of the things that I did not learn as a boy, but learned as an adult, is the concept of ancestral humility. I'm sure Roman will agree with me that when we were at Princeton, we were heavily introduced to and indoctrinated into the Western way of thinking. It was a requirement to survive that you attempt to achieve as much as you could within the context of the curriculum, the programs that they provided, or you didn't graduate. And I don't know his motivation, but my motivation was to escape from poverty. I did not like being hungry. I did not like being homeless. I worked hard to earn a little bit of money so that I could have some small things that allowed me to do the kind of work that I love to do. I was in sports. I love singing, and I was not able to participate in either unless I earned my own money so that I could buy what was necessary. In the case of singing, I remember the little gold sweater vest, the black slacks, the dress shoes, things that many people take for granted. In sports, just to get a pair of Converse sneakers required that I go out and pick strawberries or beans, pie cherries during the summertime so that I would have the things that I needed for school. That put me square into people who had a Western way of thinking. And that meant that you tried to acquire for yourself. You had to go out and tell people who you were. And in the 8 years that I spent among the elders before I moved down to Washington State, I did not hear the concept of me, of myself. I did this. But that was what I learned when I started going to school in Washington State, then at Princeton, then at the University of Michigan. I was expected to get good grades and then to say that I am a good student. What I learned when I returned to Alaska is that the ancestors worked hard to create a life where myself and others would thrive. And it took me a lot of years of listening to true elders about what it is that had to be done in Tlingit country in order to realize some of the benefits that we now have today. And what I have learned as a parliamentarian working with Native people all over the country is that those who work together, who understand that the ancestors walked a path that made it that made a culture, a society where we could thrive. The farther we get away from thinking in that way, recognizing that we belong among the pathways that the ancestors walked, meant that we were successful. And when we began to change, we began to exhibit behaviors that were not similar to the ancestors. So I'm going to go over a little bit of that before I get into talking about what I was asked to, which is the role of 93-638 of compacting, of nonprofits, and of tribal programs. So my tribe, my clan, were able to maintain a lot of independence until about 1940, 1950. In the 1940s, World War II brought the military into my homeland, and we ended up with a huge military presence and a huge runway for a village of maybe 300 or 400 people. Before that runway came in, we had to travel by boat or by walking. And so my first step to understanding and appreciating the ancestors was to realize that no matter how it was that they were confronted with the harsh realities of their existence, they learned what I now refer to as place. The place that we occupy tells us what we need to do to survive. It tells us what kind of shelter we might have available. It tells us what kind of food we can use, what kind of clothing. And the ancestors were the ones who learned that by observation, by experiment, by practice. And I began to see how it was that they were very successful and allowed us to have a lot of free time to build our relationships among each other, to build our arts, to gather our foods in a short period of time so that we could survive harsh winters. And I started to understand that it was the ancestors who created this environment where I had opportunities. I was living in a housing project. We were getting our money from the government, and I was in a high school where a counselor called me in and told me something that changed my life. I consider her one of the elders, even though she is not of my tribe. She said, "Patrick, I think you could get into Princeton." I looked at her and I said, "That's nice, Mrs. Conrad. What's Princeton?" I had no idea that there was an Ivy League. I had no idea that there was a process of getting into college. I had only said up until probably I was 13 or 14 years old that I want to go to college without understanding why, what it meant, and how I could do it. Mrs. Conrad guided me for 2 years. I put in my application, not expecting to get in. I lived 2,500 miles away from Princeton. I had never been more than in Alaska, Washington State, and Oregon by then. And when the letter arrived, it was one of those thick letters that they told you to look for because it meant you were accepted, and they were sending all of the forms that you needed to fill out. I brought my letter to Mrs. Conrad, and she said, I told her, I said, "Mrs. Conrad, it's going to cost $6,400 according to Princeton for me to go there. I cannot afford that." Her wisdom as an elder led her to tell me, Don't worry about it. Let me work on it. And that August, I was on an airplane flying to Princeton, a place I had never been to, a place that I had no idea existed about a year and a half earlier, and no idea of what I was going to be doing. All I could rely on was the faith of the elders saying, you can do it. So I arrived at Princeton. There were very few American Indians, Alaska Natives there, but I was fortunate because I had people that I could learn from on how to study. I had one individual that Roman and I were able to work with, Alfred Bush. Alfred was there for decades, who could help us understand our place at Princeton. So we were fortunate. We were able to graduate and we were able to learn. I ended up in law school. I graduated from there, and then I returned to Alaska. Ancestral humility is taught to me was not bragging about what it was that we did, but to let the elders and let the leaders introduce us. So what Josie did was how we introduced ourselves traditionally. People knew who we were. Today, what I say is that you are allowed to tell people the facts of your existence. And so what I'm going to be telling you is not me patting myself on the back, but it is recognizing my place among the ancestors who allowed me, by creating a pathway, to do the things that I had done. My mother, I give great deference to because she was the one who taught me that reading was very important. And I read at a very young age. She modeled that, she encouraged me, and through her and my grandmother, my great grandmother, who I never met, they paved a pathway for me to be a part of a culture that recognizes the way we work together. When I returned to Alaska as a young lawyer, I had a number of elders who found out who I was. I was not well known in Alaska when I arrived, and they began to show me the needs of our Alaska Native people. One of the first things that I noted when I arrived is that even though our Alaska Native men were a very small part of Alaska's total population, maybe 9–10%, they were almost 40% of the prison population. So I worked and began to work on issues that affected Native people at the request of other Native leaders at the time. And I began to be offered opportunities to learn from people who had been involved for quite a long time. So I was a part of a group that started a soup kitchen, a place where street people could come in and have a hot meal, a cup of coffee, and get out of the cold for a little while. That led to a larger soup kitchen, and it led to a shelter. By then, I was not involved with it any longer, but other individuals began to work on those public policies. One thing that I learned while at college and while working as a law intern is that in 1978, Richard Nixon ended the era of termination of tribes by signing the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act. That is the act that began to restore some tribes, and I began to study the restoration process. The Klamath in Oregon was the closest to where I grew up. All of their homelands had been sold and the proceeds distributed to their members, a very Western approach. Other tribes had the same thing happen to them. Congress had terminated their tribal status. The Klamath worked very hard to restore their tribal status. They are now, I believe, a member of the National Congress of American Indians, and participate with other tribes in trying to make sure that federal policy towards American Indians and Alaska Natives is respectful. As I began to learn, I was asked by more elders if I would serve on the board of directors of Sea Alaska Corporation. Shortly after I entered Princeton, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act had been enacted by Congress. It was the act that my elders had said they wanted to achieve in 1929 when they met as a group called the Alaska Native Brotherhood. And they passed a resolution saying that the federal government has taken our lands. We want to settle our land claims, and began the long process of negotiating with the federal government. There were already laws in place that made it difficult for us. The government said it would not settle land claims, it would only pay you for the land that you had been taken. Through the elders, I began to learn that our education has to be used to think about problems, to be innovative and creative, to learn how to go through an analysis, which I now refer to as a systems analysis, to learn information about all of the things that we face and confront. As I went through that process, I was invited to be a member of a group that was attempting to restore the Tlingit language, along with our two sister clans, the Haida and the Tsimshian, that was asked to restore our arts and to work on access to our traditional foods. In that capacity, I met many true elders. And what I say about true elders is that when we were a clan living among our other in-laws, we had the training while we were growing up by the elders that transferred our culture, traditions, stories, all of the things that we needed to survive constantly. So we were a part of a multiple generation upbringing. So we would have the great-grandmothers, the grandmothers, the aunties, the uncles. We didn't refer to our cousins as cousins, we referred to them as brother and sister. And our clans gave us everything that we needed to survive, but they changed regularly. And we had to change. And one of the changes was after our land was taken, we had to try and negotiate with the government. While we were doing that, working on after we received our land, an elder from one of our strongest clans was sitting next to me, and we were listening to people who were up talking. They were not reflecting any ancestral humility. They were talking about me, about us, about what I deserve. And he leaned over to me and says, "Patrick, one of the things that you are going to need to learn among our people is the difference between elders and old people." I asked and followed up, and that's what I got, is that old people are ones who think about themselves. They don't think about the clan, about what we reflect as a people together. They are looking at what is in it for them. And then people like Richard told me that when we were trying to settle our land claims, our elders who were not wealthy would take their nickels, their quarters. They would contribute to send our leaders back to Washington, D.C., to hire lawyers, and to work on regaining land for our people, not for themselves. the government wanted to give us allotments. We wanted to have land that belonged to our clans, our tribes, our people. And so that's what I was introduced to when I was asked to be on the board of our business corporation. And that is where I began to learn and understand 93-638 compacting. In 1989, the corporation that had been formed for my father's people, the Aleut, they were going bankrupt. They filed Chapter 11. That meant they felt they could get out of it. If they had filed bankruptcy, they stood to lose their land under Chapter 7. Under Chapter 11, they were going to reorganize. And I learned that all of the other regional corporations, like the one that I was on and the one that my dad belonged to, worked together. They talked about solving the problems collectively. They had lots of conversations, lots of discussions, and they found a way for bringing my dad's former corporation out of bankruptcy. And within about between 10 and 15 years, that corporation, with about 2,000 members, had over $1 billion in revenue from the business operations that they ran. And they made it there using compacting for 93-638 programs. This one was called the Small Business Administration's 8A programs. And what the company was able to do, its name was Chugach Alaska Corporation, was to get contracts from the federal government to run or to manage programs that the federal government has. And the big one that they started with was called base operating contracts. So we have a military base here in Anchorage called JBER, Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. They have Alaska Native corporations that work to take care of things like maintenance, construction, operations. Native corporations have operated the kitchens, the mess halls for the federal government. My corporation did cleanup for the federal government. The federal government would come into one of their bases. They would bring a lot of chemicals, a lot of fuels, a lot of oils, and they would not dispose of them properly. Oftentimes, they would just bury them. And so under the environmental laws, many of our corporations formed these businesses under the Small Business Administration's 8A to manage those contracts for the federal government. It led to an amazing result for one of my father's people, some of my ancestors, and I want to spend a little time with them because I ended up in 2003 being the chief executive for a nonprofit that got grants and worked under the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act by compacting for tribal services. So I am differentiating now. My initial experience was with the SBA 8A program, which, as applied to Alaska Natives in 1989, changed the ability of our for-profit businesses to earn significant amounts of income. And then the nonprofit, which is called Chugachmute, and Josie introduced that when she was introducing me, that nonprofit compacted for services that were provided by the Indian Health Service, Department of Education, and Department of Interior. And so I'm going to work first because the pathway to compacting for tribal services didn't really get underway until the 1990s, but the contracting with the federal government under 93-638 and the Small Business Administration 8A program began a little bit earlier. One of the corporations that I am most proud of is one where some of my ancestors came from, a little village in Prince William Sound, Alaska, that had only about 120 people living there in 1964 during the Great Alaska Earthquake. The village of Chiniga was destroyed. Almost half of its population died in the tsunami that wiped Chiniga away from where its homeland was. Only one building survived, and that was the Russian Orthodox Church that was at the top of the hill. The survivors made it there and had to wait for a few days until rescue could make it to them. I began to understand, as I listened to the stories, a concept that I call the Stockdale paradox. After a prisoner of war in Vietnam, which was really prominent when I was a boy, James Stockdale, as a prisoner of war, suffered. He spent 8 years as a prisoner of war where he was tortured, and he was the senior officer who was trying to keep all of his soldiers alive. And when he told his story, he said something that reminded me of Chiniga. He said, in order to survive, he had to learn how to accept the brutal realities of his existence. As an Alaska Native, I immediately understood that what the federal government did to us was the brutal reality of our existence. And in recognizing that how they treated us created a lot of problems. One of the problems it created for us is that we didn't get title to all of our homelands. We don't have a reservation. We have one township of land that belongs to a corporation. And there are a lot of problems that we had to solve. So we don't have a reservation, and that means different ways of operating compared to what we refer to as a lower 48, where you do have reservations. And we dealt with those problems and issues. Chiniga, through its leadership, which included one of my cousins, Larry Evanoff, went to the state of Alaska, went to the Congress, and they began to rebuild their village in another location that was not subject to tsunamis. They only had 55 people living there. And in the 1980s, there was a disaster in Prince William Sound called the Exxon Valdez oil spill. That oil spill disrupted their village for a long time, but one of the outcomes of that was that the land that the village corporation for Chiniga had was, they didn't sell the land, but what they sold was their ability to harvest the timber on their lands and sell it. They got over $70 million from that. And one of their leaders, one of their approximately 80 or 90 members, had some experience in business. And as this leader learned from Chugach Alaska Corporation how to get contracts under the Small Business Administration's program, they started to do that. They formed businesses that bid on federal contracts. Last year, I spoke to one of their senior officers, and he told me that they had earned $1.25 billion in gross revenue and $125 million in gross profit for less than 200 members. I want that to sink in. 200 members. $125 million in gross profit, which probably meant about 80 to 90 million for 200 members. They can do anything they want to do. And it started off with a dream that came after hard work by our elders. I was blown away when I was hired after I got frustrated with lawyers and the practice of law to be the chief executive of a nonprofit that was fairly small and compacted for various programs, including healthcare. That was my education in compacting, which again was amazing and guided by many elders. One of them, and I should explain that elders are not old people. Elders are anyone who is a leader, has learned the wisdom of the elders, is not bound up in your own ego. It's not about me. It's about a concept that the Haudenosaunee, the 5 civilized tribes, expressed in their constitution called the 7th generation. The 7th generation has 2 versions. The version that I believe in is where we recognize 3 generations of ancestors, great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents. Everyone here would be the 4th generation, and the descendants would be our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. That's enough distance between ancestors and descendants to do what I believe is most important, and that is to take out the me in all of that, to take out our ego, to not make it about us. We should have by now been successful because of what the ancestors did. That was what was offered to me, but it was taken away for many others. Josie mentioned that I have worked almost since I started college on transforming Indian country for the benefit of our less privileged. One of the first things that I was allowed to work on was the Indian Child Welfare Act. It was passed in 1978 as well, but in 1972, I was on the board as a student member of the Association on American Indian Affairs and got to watch what it took for legislation to benefit our people. It took a lot of selflessness. I did run into a lot of people who brag. They say, I was responsible for the Indian Child Welfare Act, or I was responsible for this. That's not the way that the elders told me we are supposed to think. We are to think about the 7th generation. We are to have a great big dream, a vision, a goal for the 7th generation. And so I began thinking in terms like that when I got to Chugachmute. I was not very experienced at it. So what I would tell my board of directors, who were the tribal leaders, is that I wanted our people to be happy, healthy, well-educated, well-trained, able to live and survive anywhere in the world, but wanting to come back home and work with us. I realize that's what Chiniga Corporation allowed them to do with its 125 million in gross income. And I wanted to see the same thing for the people living in the villages. I wanted to see them happy, healthy, well-educated, well-trained, able to survive anywhere in the world, but wanting to come back and live at home. So for 9 years, I worked at that, but I learned the process of compacting, and I was shown what could really happen. And I will be brutally honest. I have Navajo friends that I've had for, gosh, what is it now, Roman, 50 years? Yeah, I just had my 50th reunion. So Roman and Larry came they've been friends of mine for 48 years. And Rexley Jim, not quite as long. And I have met quite a number. And then my son shared with me our origin story, which is why Chief said that we are relatives. Our origin story comes from the Diné people here in Alaska. And it is said that there were 2 Diné migrations. One of them was sent and never came back. That was, we believe, you. The other one was sent and became us, the Tlingit. And so our separation is probably about 8,000 years. Athabascan language and Navajo are understandable with each other. So the brutal realities of what I saw as an experienced executive running compacts is, why the heck is the Navajo Nation not compacting for their health care? With 400,000 members, the largest tribe in the world, here's how my brain now thinks. Your user population is huge. That user population is the funding base that the Indian Health Service uses to fund healthcare on the reservation. When we compacted in Alaska, we got that base, that user population funding coming to our healthcare systems. One of the elders that I was working with was from a little community called Seldovia. Seldovia had about 800 people living there. They had a health clinic that they built for about, I believe it was $25 to $30 million. They were allowed to provide healthcare services through other federal programs to people who lived not in their village, but on the area that they lived. They built that clinic using a program that the Indian Health Services calls a joint venture program. The joint venture program gives a employment package to the tribe. They do 2 things. They pay a monthly lease to the tribe for the building. So Seldovia had to build the building. They had to raise the funds, borrow the funds, but they had this lease from the Indian Health Service. They ended up with a beautiful clinic. With the employment package, they got the money to hire a lot of professionals, doctors, nurses, behavioral health specialists, and they ran a program that was just amazing for their approximately 800 people and probably another 5,000 to 8,000 people. And then I did some work as a parliamentarian for the Kanaitsi tribe. They had a $52 million facility built under the joint venture program with the same employment package for about 800 people. 400,000 people would lead to what the Cherokee Nation has done. They have a huge hospital. They have doctors and nurses and specialists. Along the way, as we were working under our compacts, we were allowed to do something the Indian Health Service was not. We were allowed to bill for patients on Medicare, meaning our elders, on Medicaid, our people who were in poverty, and through healthcare, our people who were employed. I looked at that from my base of experience, and what I realized is that your nation gave up a lot.
Yes.
Huge amounts. I was an applicant for Sage Memorial about 4 or 5 years ago, and I got a chance to look in healthcare on the reservation. And I talked to Rex Lee a little bit about it, and just let him know that, in my humble opinion, this was an opportunity that should have been taken, but was not for various reasons. But it's not one that can't be resumed. And I understand that there are groups who would are talking about it. But that being said, when Roman suggested that Josie and Chief contact me, I was happy to talk with them about my experience, and then they introduced me to the land issues that the tribe is being faced. They introduced me to the Leasing Act, and I began to ask, why are you not compacting for it? And it was explained to me, and what I said was that if there are apparently about 30 employees that used to be in the realty program with BIA, that's the same as the base funding that you would get for compacting. And then we got off into a conversation about being innovative and creative and using the big dream, the vision of the seventh generation, the happy, healthy, well-educated, well-trained people, whatever it is that your big dream is, 3 generations out, to begin to guide the governance for these organizations. What I see as one problem is that the land, while collectively owned, is something that you can get possessive over. You can talk about it being my land as opposed to being our land. And what Chief spoke about in terms of traditionally working with each other is that we had conversations. I'm going to go back to Chiniga and my cousin, Larry Evanoff. I asked him one time, I said, Larry, how was the village governed? The answer shocked me. It turned out that 1 or 2 nights a week, they have a steam facility, a steam bath, and one night a week, the women would go to a steam bath. They called it a banya. Another night, the men would. The leadership would sit in the banya and talk about the problems and issues that the village faced, and they would solve them there. That blew me away. That is a very intimate type of thing, and yet here we are sitting together talking about the village, not in anger, but in solving problems. I was reading a book on what I thought was healthcare, and the man who wrote the book, a man named Andrew Zolli, was talking about problem solving in Palau. My daughter's mother lived in Palau, and I was familiar with it. It's a very small country on an island in the South Pacific with about 35,000 people. What Mr. Zolli wrote about was a man they referred to as a translational leader. So Mr. Henderson had asked in an email and provided some research on translational thinking. I thank you for that. It forced me to go and try and explain translational leadership in a way that we understand traditionally. We always have members of our clans, our tribes, our people who have been sent away to become well educated. And many, surprisingly enough, ended up at some of the greatest colleges in the world. They got exposed to new things. They would study and learn those as elders traditionally did as scientists. They would observe, they would ask questions, they would see how things work. One man in Palau filled that role as a translational leader when the tourism industry and some of the members of the Palau community wanted to bring in diving to their coral beds. They were resisted by a group of young fishermen who made their living and got their food by fishing. Scientists were brought in, experts were brought in. The translational leader, without being a politician and saying we have to do this, brought together the elders, brought together the young men, and brought together the experts where they talked and they worked and they came up with a compromise that benefited the community. That compromise included opening Palau to diving, protecting and restoring the coral. Protecting the coral included things like having an anchor buoy. Instead of letting boats go out and drag their anchor on the coral and destroy the coral, they put down a buoy, probably connected to a very heavy piece of concrete with chains going up to the buoy, and that's where they anchored. They closed down the tourist season when the fish were spawning. They did all of that work beforehand. They did all of that work through conversations, and they used a translational leader. When I explained that to the group that I was meeting with, they liked the concept. In essence, by my coming to you today and explaining our experience, I am fulfilling the role of a translational leader. I am pointing out opportunities that you have to not only restore what it is that existed, but to build to a generation vision, dream. I oftentimes lose track. We're at 9/11. Anyone needs to take a quick break, the like, this is a time. It's also probably a good time to ask if there are any questions. I know that oftentimes my explanations are not understood, and I really want people to have the opportunity to ask questions. So, Josie, at this point, if we can take a little bit of time to address any questions that might have come up. Afterwards, I'll just do a little bit on innovative and creative thinking from a tribal perspective, and then we'll have another opportunity for questions. So I'll turn it over to you for a little bit, Josie, to see if there are any questions that people might have.
Thank you, Patrick. People, just jump in, please. Or if you feel...
This is Daniel.
Daniel.
Yeah, hey to everybody. And thank you, Chief, for starting the meeting, and then to Mr. Anderson. My name is Daniel, so I was a member of the council from 1986 to 1995, a member of the Navajo Nation Council. And at the early 90s, our past president, chairman, we had talked about compacting education and had secured some federal funding to do a study. And of course, by that time I was out of the council and I really never found out what occurred. And then also I was named to the BIA reorganization task force by former Senator John McCain. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was decentralize Bureau of Indian Affairs. And for the Navajo Nation, we had come up with a proposal to eliminate the Navajo Region Office and give more authority to the agency offices, the agency superintendents, and of course the next council didn't go with it. I served on the 2019-2023 Navajo Nation Council, chair of the Health, Education, Human Services Committee. We had, at the time, Ms. Rosalind So being the Indian Area Director of IHS, and we really talked about compacting the IHS. We were 30 days away from traveling up to see your organization. And of course, COVID hit, and that was the end of it. But it's a very, I view it as a way to really enhance services and enhance the quality of healthcare. So I am just thankful that Brother Roman suggested you, and thank you for the presentation. And I right now I feel like we need to, I guess, do a series of meetings, Zoom meetings, one about the land management, the one about healthcare, another one about education, those aspects. Those would be, because the compacting is so far-reaching, as you say, into the seventh generation, and I really feel like it could happen. I'm an Eastern agency, an allotment owner. I have 6 siblings, and I seriously asked that we form a corporation. And my oldest brother said no, and the rest of the other siblings just let it be. But the thought was to put a solar array on at least 40 acres of our 160 acre allotment. And that would be better than royalties. It would be revenue. And that's what my thoughts were. And we'll see how it goes going forward. But I appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. So. I appreciate the invitation. And as you mentioned, Roman's recommendation that I speak. I put up on the screen a overlay of an island in Southeast Alaska. That is the only Indian reservation in Alaska. And what I was trying to envision as a part of the 7th generation, Mr. So, was a village of the future that embodied what you were talking about, improvements in health, improvements in education, improvements in revenue and employment, businesses. And that's the foundation. I let my mind go wild and crazy to talk about all of the things that you discussed. This is on my website, which I will put into the chat for anyone who wants to see it. And then I'll come back here and ask if there are other questions. I have some responses, Mr. So, after any other questions are asked.
Hello, Josie, can you hear me?
Yep. Go ahead.
I want to know, my name is Will Sosi, and I'm living here in Shiprock, although transplanted from Eastern Agency as well, owner of over 3,000 acres of allotted land with my family. My question to Mr. Anderson is if he knew a person named Bob Lozier.
I
And
do.
the reason is that I went to college with Bob and we graduated the same year. And later, I understand that he was elected to the Alaskan legislature, sponsor a bill for that See Alaska. So, and then I heard, unfortunately, like in around 2015, that he went into the forest, as the Tlingit call it, passing of life, going into the forest. I just want to know if you know Bob. Thank you.
Yes, I had been a longtime friend of Bob, and he was hired as the president of Sea Alaska Corporation for a period of time. His wife, Helen, is Aleut from my dad's home country. Helen worked for me at Chugachmute. They unfortunately divorced, and then Bob had pretty severe diabetes, and that's what he passed away from. But no, Bob was a leader here, starting off in the same way that I did. He was not a lawyer, but he was working with Alaska Legal Services, providing services. But I can confirm that he did pass, and as you say, as we say, he walked into the forest.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Pleased
Percy,
to meet you, Trick.
Percy, did you have something?
Did you call on me, Josie?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you again, Patrick, and everyone that's on the call this morning. Well, I mean, it's good to hear the background, just with the whole, with Alaskan villages and, you know, the structuring, because I know a friend of mine who was giving me a bit of that background when I used to be teaching with her in Washington State, and I always found it very amazing. And when you're saying, you know, as far as like looking at this, I don't know if it's probably the same in a lot of tribes where we're working in a lot of silos within the own government departments that are supposed to be help serving the people, and even it seems to be communities are working in silos in themselves. And so if we're looking at this vision of, you know, more unity and more collaboration, I just want to see what your thoughts are at that.
They go very deep, Wendy. They go all the way back to how we organized as hunters and gatherers, and into modern science and theories. Hunters and gatherers, according to a lot of scientists, are typically a number of people who are related and less than 150. That comes from research that was conducted to explore how many relationships we can have as an individual. And Robin Dunbar, a British scientist, anthropologist, doing research on primates, came up with that number. It's called the Dunbar number. So this Dunbar number consists of what he refers to as intimate relationships, which he numbers about 5, about real close friendships, which number about 15, friendships, which number about 50, and an additional 100 to make up the 150 of people that we can know fairly well. And as I looked at it, I said, gosh, that kind of fits our clan structure up here. We have clan houses that we lived in multi-generation back around the turn of the 1900. up to about 1920, we had clan houses that would hold maybe 100 people, 150 people, and they would have the intimate bondings, the close friendships, the relationships. They weren't all just our clan. We would have the in-laws. The in-laws were the opposite clan that we married. And what I saw as a relationship within this Dunbar number is that if we had the pair bonds and we had this shared culture, another researcher, a sleep researcher, interestingly enough, from the University of Toronto, wrote a book that explained to me that our customs and traditions are what bind us. And so our origin story is important. That's the origin of the Tlingit people. That's the origin of the Navajo people. Your origin story is important because that's what bind you. The stories, the cultures, the traditions, the language are what keep you together. That is what David Sampson, the University of Toronto professor, talks about, and he calls it campcraft. And I think he calls it campcraft because it's the stories, the traditions that bind us. From here, when I explain it, I go off to the Catholic Church, because you can go anywhere in the world. There are 1.5 billion Catholics who believe the same thing because the Catholic Church teaches the same thing everywhere in the world, and they have a structure of leadership, starting with the Pope, going down to cardinals, and then moving on down into the ranks of the priests and the nuns, who are all teaching the same thing. So what that taught me, Wendy, is that we share a lot. Traditionally, we have not maintained it as we have gone more into a Western world. When I first got up to Alaska, the elders had told me about what they called visiting around. I realized that I understood it because when I was a boy living in my dad's homeland, I could go into my uncle's house and open his refrigerator and grab a branch of herring eggs and take it, and I didn't have to ask. Other people would come in and they would have a cup of coffee. They would have always a stew pot or a soup pot on, and you could come in and you would visit and you would actually sit there and look at people and talk to them. We don't do that anymore. We go out and we have a list of people. Oh, I need to know that one. I need to know that one. And this one can help me do this, and this one can help me do that. The Dunbar number are the people that we sit down with, that we have conversations, that we talk about our similarities, and we talk about what we dream for the seventh generation. I know that's a long-winded explanation, but there are reasons our elders visited around. There are reasons our elders told the stories. They bound us together, and we have lost that bond because we no longer do that in a wide range. And I believe we can restore a lot of that, but we need to have conversations about how we do restore it. And one of those bonds can actually be compacting, because the compact area can reflect the same kind of operation, the same kinds of discussions, to come up with important improvements, seventh generation improvements, which guide me every day. And I hope that responds, but I'll go back and let you respond to that by saying whether it makes any sense or not.
It does, thank you. And definitely that introduction of ourselves within our culture of clans really sets that in relationships with one another. I just think we jumped on the fast track with technology in the Western world, and we need to learn to slow down, because we're, as you shared, those are important elements to contain and maintain. And but it just kind of you feel a little bit lost when you feel that you're not seeing this happening within your communities, but do know that you can. So I appreciate your time, and I am.
Absolutely.
Patrick, would you like to rest for a little?
Oh no, I'm fine. I do 8 hour days with breaks after about 2 hours. So this is just 1/4 of a day of training for me.
Is there?
Josie, can I say a few words? This is David.
Yes, David. David Sosi, go ahead.
Good morning, Josie, and then also Patrick. It's really comforting to hear a lot of the things that you're talking about from your past experience, and then also mainly keeping in mind a lot of the traditional ways of our people. And I especially like the fact how the men folks gathered in the sweat lodge, and then the women folks, and talk about a lot of the issues that confronts them or that have confronted them, and to be able to resolve those in a, I guess, a comfortable, uh, peaceful manner. And I think it's important. I know it's important to reach back to our traditional ways to confront a lot of the things that I basically like to refer to as the foreign adversary, the concepts and their way of life and their belief system has really eroded a lot of our traditional ways. And I think more and more we're being taken over by that by that endeavor from the foreigners. But I believe that we need to kind of get back on our feet and start employing a lot of our traditional belief system in combating this, and then also exploring ways in which we can bring about more stability among our native people. And with our people, the Diné people, we have the Hogan, we have the fire there in the middle of the Hogan. And then anytime when we talk about different traditional stories or belief system, or even wanting to explore what can be done to address many of the issues, we have the tobacco and the water there because we consider the tobacco to be really sacred, and then the water, and then the fire. So, and they're like participants. They have spirits, and these spirits, they have accumulated knowledge throughout the centuries from our ancestors, have talked about many things in front of them, so they know. So we kind of go back to them and have them be like participants in guiding us. So, and I believe that that's sort of something that we need to go back to. And so I enjoyed your presentation thus far and how you're talking about these certain things. So just a comment that I wanted to make just out of enjoying listening to your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comments, David. I appreciate those. Probably a good time for me to jump off into a little bit of the seventh generation and some of my experiences working with tribal leaders from all over Alaska and the country. My tribal grandson, Clarence Jackson, told me this story that has resonated with me. He's my grandson because he was raised by a member of my clan, the Thunderbird or Shankukedi. And what he told me is that he would watch his grandfather compose a speech, and he would practice that speech in front of his wife, who was the opposite clan. And so we are Eagle. His wife was Raven. She was the in-law, and she would critique the speech. If there was any hint that anything that my clan member might say that would offend the in-laws, she would let him know, and he would change it. And he never spoke without writing it down, because it was so important that we not offend our in-laws. That was the respect that we used to have that we no longer really have. I'm a parliamentarian because I want to see that respect in our meetings. And I'm trying to convert parliamentary law under Robert's rules into indigenous thinking so that we don't really have to use the rules. We will understand that it's not our role to step in and dominate and try to get other people to do what we want. It's our duty and responsibility not to offend our in-laws, and to have conversations that bring us to a place where we all benefit. I believe that our seventh generation goals and conversations about those are how we will improve. And I want to, I guess as my last couple of points, bring up the brutal realities of our existence, which for many of us are forced relocations, termination of life by white people, torture, boarding schools, and overall bad treatment. Historical trauma is what I refer to it. Historical trauma has not been addressed in a positive way. Instead, we talk about it, but we don't talk about how we resolve it, how we create solutions. It's a much more complex topic. All I really want to say is that we need to be in charge of our healthcare. We need to be in charge of our behavioral health. We need to be in charge of our education so that we can begin to apply our traditional values to those. But that doesn't mean do it the old way. We need to recognize what was good among our elders' way, but translate that in with a new science to the best ways possible. And I wanted to give one hint or of how I was able to learn from non-Indian elders how we can operate our businesses, how we can operate our healthcare extremely well. I learned from a man who had a PhD in economics, a master's in business administration, and a Juris Doctorate. A very talented, very well-educated man. He was married to an Indian woman. And Dr. Jackson was my teacher in Japanese management systems that are in the United States are called lean management, lean thinking, lean production, lean healthcare. I implemented that everywhere I went. I am convinced that it is the pathway to the future for us. I have not been able to convince our Alaska Native businesses. The system came from Toyota, the automobile manufacturing company out of Japan. My son showed me yesterday, Toyota had about $39 billion in profits the year before. $39 billion. Ford had $9 billion. The reason Toyota had $39 billion in profits is that their management system is about as close as I can envision being a management system that our elders would have bought into, would have sanctioned. And the reason I mean that is that as a student of another non-native elder, Dr. W. Edwards Deming, it's really important for us, and Dr. Deming taught this, that we respect everyone we work with, that we give them opportunities to be proud of what they do, that we create a place that is safe for them psychologically. That's a very deep topic, but it's a topic I believe we need to have conversations about. I have been unable to promote those conversations here in Alaska because we have become very westernized. Our native leaders of our corporations demand huge salaries. The biggest salaries I have seen are from the North Slope, the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. 2 of their native executives have earned $12 million last year each. That was their salary. Our healthcare. One of our leaders, who's now passed on, earned $1 million just for being chairman of the board of directors, and he held another full-time job where he earned $500,000. I object to that. While we have people living in poverty, people who are in prison, mothers who cannot afford food for their children, cannot really bring them the type of health care that we need to be focused as a people on the 7th generation, working to secure those benefits to everyone. We can't do it in a Western society. We can do it if we take lessons like that taught to me by Toyota, by Dr. W. Edwards Deming, by another hero of mine. He did the Adverse Childhood Experience study. And he and Dr. Bob Anda, Dr. Vincent Felitti, and Dr. Robert Anda explored trauma in people and has defined what trauma does to us. It's responsible for many of the bad things that happen to our children. And Wendy, I think you said you were a teacher at one time in Washington State. Washington State has embraced the teachings of the Adverse Childhood Experience study. They have a diagram that shows how many kids in a classroom of 30 have experienced this childhood trauma and how it has impacted their ability to learn, how it has impacted their parents' ability to make an income. There are just so many lessons that we have to learn. And that's one of the reasons that I mentioned that compacting is a way that the tribe can begin to understand that you have the ability, when you have control over those huge amounts of resources, and I'm talking substantial. We only have 170,000 people here in the state of Alaska, which is, what is that, about a third of your population, the Navajo reservation. You could be a powerhouse in health, in behavioral research. You have great universities that surround you that are working on these very topics. That's why I say the brutal realities of your existence is not having the conversation about taking over the compacting with 400,000 people. I look at something that we have up here in Alaska that you don't. It's called a Form 990. It's an IRS form that nonprofits have to fill out instead of a tax return. Our South Central Foundation, our Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, they all fill out a Form 990. And if you would like, I can provide some of those to you. Our South Central Foundation had it's called in the nonprofit world, it's called a fund balance. In the for-profit world, it's called a profit. They had $40 million in a fund balance. That meant it was money they did not spend on healthcare. So there are opportunities out there. It's why I promote the 7th generation. It's why I promote ancestral humility. It's why I promote conversations. Not everyone should be speaking, but they should have access to someone who is a speaker. We cannot all go into a meeting of 400,000 people and expect to speak, but what we can do is we can have all of these steam baths. We can have people who are translational leaders and who are leaders fixed on a seventh generation goal who had those conversations for us. That is the lesson that I learned from Robin Dunbar and the 150 close relationships that we can have. They can be extended by promoting a culture that we used to have where our leaders heard what was going on among all of our people because everyone spoke and they listened. So with that leaves us about 15 minutes for any discussion or conversation. Or if you want me to expand on anything, there'll be other opportunities, I'm sure, to discuss more of these topics. But for right now, this was just basic introduction to how I think and how I feel. Those of you who have spoken already have some resonance with what I've learned from our ancestors. So what we're talking about now is merging what it is that your ancestors came up with to allow you to be where you are today, and then what you as fourth generation leaders can envision for a seventh generation for your great grandchildren and begin to work towards it. I've just given you some ideas. I'm not asking you to adopt any of them. I just want you to understand from our experience where we have made substantial progress. I haven't even talked about the huge employment that happens in our healthcare systems, as well as the healthcare that's being provided. Those are benefits that have to be discussed and implemented in a way that allows you to benefit your people. So, Josie, I'll turn it back over to you to moderate for the final 15 minutes of our discussion here.
Patrick, so we have 15 minutes of questions. Is there any other questions? Please just speak up.
Josie, I have a question. This is Will Sosi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Patrick, could you describe the structure of your tribal government?
The Central Council of Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes does not have territory. We were created by an act of Congress in 1939, and the purpose was to have a tribal entity to negotiate the settlement of our land claims. The structure that was set up is that we have chapters in communities. So there is a chapter in Anchorage, our 13 villages in Southeast Alaska, Seattle, San Francisco, and all of these chapters have their membership. The membership is to the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes. We have to submit our membership application, which my mother did for me in like 1969, 1970. Where we live is allowed to elect representatives to an annual conference, where they come and they guide and direct and elect a president. They elect 6 vice presidents, first through 6, that are all voted on by all of those members. And then they meet during the rest of the year. The president is the chief executive, and he's responsible for hiring and managing all of the programs that they compact for. Other tribes deal a little bit differently, but they're all pretty similar in many respects to that.
Yeah, well, I believe that in Alaska, they can have subunits, subchapters when they receive compact block grants, the subunits can be delegated. All of those monies are similar to possibilities here.
Yes. Any structure that can be envisioned is open to tribal interpretation. So for a very large tribe with one entity like yours, there are structures that imaginative lawyers can come up with that can look at the subunits. And my understanding, without having been there and looking at them, is that you already have a lot of subunits for land and agencies and areas of the Navajo Nation. It's such a huge place that it sounds like it's sort of a state or a municipal government structure that you have
Not
throughout.
exactly.
Yeah, but
Subunits without authority.
yeah,
Subunits without delegated authority.
yeah, and that authority can be delegated, Josie.
Definitely. Santana had a question. Santana?
Probably on mute.
Santana, you're on mute. Okay, while we wait for Santana, is there any other question?
This is Roman. I appreciate the presentation, Patrick. It's probably 52 years since we first met at Princeton. So
Wow.
it's been that long, half a century. So I think one of the issues that we have over here is a different land status from, from Alaska. We have trust land, and then we have Indian allotments that you have over there too. But I think because of the land status and because of the bureaucracy, there are many areas that are problem areas in terms of a authority, in terms of the governance issues, in terms of the approval by the government versus what we would like to see, local control, local approval, and the role of family. And so when we go through these various issues and problems, I know you have a map system that you use for resolving those areas of problems, to identify the root causes and then to maybe identify some recommendations, because there are different interests. You know, people with allotments have different interests in people that are living on trust lands that may conflict as a Navajo Nation policy on development matters. So, it clashes, between groups of people. And there's that type of, I think that, at some point maybe you can make just some statement in terms of how you would view it and then how you would approach it. And that would be something that I would be interested in.
Absolutely, Roman. So the Stockdale paradox, acknowledging the brutal realities of your existence, is feared by many people. What I was taught by my sensei in the lean management world is a concept that most people don't agree with. Problems are treasures. He told me that time and again. Patrick, problems are treasures. If you acknowledge the problem, you have a chance to solve it. When you have a problem, he taught me how to state it. I state the problem in no more than 2 or 3 sentences. The reason for that is that you don't want to tackle a huge, huge, monstrous problem. You want to understand, and this root cause analysis is central to it, you want to understand why the problem happens. I use a process called the 5 whys. When I'm teaching it, I talk about reviving your inner 2-year-old. What do 2-year-olds do all the time? They ask why. That's how they learn. That's how we learn the root cause of a problem. We ask why until we cannot answer it anymore. And then we try to solve for it. If it's a complex problem, we break it down into parts and we solve little parts of the problem. So my sensei taught me a form called an A3. It has a problem in it, and then it has the current state. What is it that we see as the reason for the problem? And that's a structure, a system. Then we begin to go look at potential solutions to that problem. And that's where we can't have a conversation that I refer to as a divergent conversation. I'm pretty sure every last person on this Zoom call has made a suggestion and had someone tell them, oh, that'll never work. We've tried it before. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Oh, it won't work. We've tried it before. That's a convergent conversation. It's one where you protest from the beginning. Oh, it's not my idea, so it won't work. A divergent conversation is one where you all have a right to say whatever it is you choose to say without being contested to start with. Then, when you have all these ideas, you sort them out and figure out which ones are good. You vote on them and say, yeah, I think that one might work. That one might work. Well, no, that's probably not ready to tackle that one. That one's too big. And then you begin to solve problems. You solve problems where they occur. You're not having someone sitting in a council meeting saying, oh, they said they have this problem. We're going to solve it for them and tell them to do this. No, you let them solve the problem. That's what Toyota does. The concept of indigenous time is circular. The concept of Western time is linear. So when I got to Princeton, it was all about, I have to finish my classwork for this semester. That semester was done, and then I have to finish the classwork for that one. Then I have to get into law school, and I have to pass the bar exam. Circular time, we are continuously looking at everything that we're involved and engaged in. We're always learning. Dr. Deming teaches something called the PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act, or adjust. That cycle tells us in an indigenous world that we are always observing and watching and making small improvements, sometimes big improvements. My son tells me that when rifles, firearms were introduced in Alaska, the Tlingits, boom, they were on those because we were fighting the Russians, and the Russians had weapons, and when we had weapons, we were able to counter. So this whole problem solving, it can't be fearful. I see people come up and they, we have this problem, we have to take care of it, and we have to do it this way. No, we have to talk about it. We identify it, Roman, in this problem statement. If it's too big, we break it down. We understand the current state, and then we dream about a future state, and then we go through this circular process, this indigenous process of plan, do, check, act. We talk about potential solutions. That's the planning part. We try the solution. If it works, wonderful. It leads us to ability to solve additional problems related to it. If we don't solve it, then we go back through, we plan, do, we check on whether it worked. If it worked, fine, we adjust to solve the next problem. And so there's a structured way of doing it. It involves translational leaders who can bring this process to you. And sometimes they're called consultants, like my sensei. I hired him to do 6 improvement events, one of which led to a $500,000 savings out of a $2.5 million healthcare budget that we were able to take and apply to dental care in our villages. And within about 2.5 years, we had almost 90% of our 1,300 patients living in the villages who had their primary prevention and restorative dental care done in their villages. $500,000 using this method. So when I talked about Toyota having a $39 billion profit, Ford having a $9 billion profit, it comes from Toyota's way of solving problems, which is continuous and involves this A3. With land, which you cited, Roman, after you've solved a lot of the problems and you have a structure in place, for the rest of you, what we had is a conversation among the small group of Roman, Joey, Chief, and Josie and I talked about my recommendation to Taos Pueblo. They would need a new sewage system, and they needed millions and millions of dollars to do that new sewage system. So I recommended something that I had read about happening in Australia, which is to take sewage and convert it to something called biochar. Biochar is terra preta. It's the black earth of our indigenous cultures in the Midwest and in the Amazon. It's 12, 13 feet deep of black earth that is incredibly productive for agriculture. Biochar is a burned product, low oxygen, high temperatures, and it produces a black rock that can be used for a variety of things. And I can send anyone, and I think I sent it to Josie, she can send it out. That's not to tell you to start creating biochar. I went back, Josie, afterwards and looked at how sewage was handled on the reservation. There is great potential for, instead of building a new $100 million sewage system, of building a couple of collection centers and burning sewage. That way you create this black rock. This black rock can be put back into your soil. It absorbs something like 38% of its weight in water. It helps keep water in an arid environment. It absorbs carbon and holds on to it for about 1,000 years. So we meet some of the climate change. This fulfills some of the stewardship, the relationship with Mother Earth that I read and have heard that the Navajo have. So being creative and innovative is a part of this whole process. That's where psychological safety comes in and a lot of these concepts. I want to stress something. I had my 72nd birthday yesterday. For that 50 plus years that Roman and I have known each other, we were taught to be curious, to learn, to understand who our elders were, to break down arguments and thoughts, to think. That's 52 years of training to do that. I don't expect anyone else to come up over a 2-hour conversation with that. We need to introduce that to our children in their education system, in our stories and language and culture. We need to encourage them to find answers to problems. And when we do that, then we start building the culture where we have people who have been benefited by the elders in transmitting knowledge to me. Notice that I talked about the people who have given me this opportunity. The introduction talked about the concepts of space, place, time, being, and becoming. That came from Dr. Alfonso Ortiz in a book that he wrote. Dr. Ortiz was a professor at Princeton for only 1 year that I was there, but he embedded in my mind this concept of space. We believe in the infinite. Everything has a spirit. We learn from our place. We learn how to be, which means that we have conversation. So instead of going through social media and saying, "Oh gosh, look at Roman's new post," we sit down and we look each other in the eye and we have discussions, even if it's in a steam bath. Becoming is the 7th generation. I learned that by recalling what Dr. Ortiz wrote in his book and mentioned in the one class I was able to take. We're not going to get there overnight, but we need to have the conversations that tell us what we need to be taking from our ancestors and putting into what we want to see and believe can happen for our great-grandchildren. And so, what I know, I've learned. What I know may not be right, but if we can have conversations about it respectfully, we can come up with a shared vision, a shared dream, a shared problem-solving method based on what our ancestors have already developed.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yes, and I think we're 3 minutes over.
Santana, please go. You'll be the last, and then Ray will send us off if there's nothing else. Santana, what was your question?
Yeah. So I'm Santana. So I just was kind of curious on where you were stopped in terms of like passing policies and like certain laws, because I don't know, I feel like as a young person, I think there's a lot of like knowledge that I need to learn. So I think there's, I don't know. I'm very curious to see what kind of stuff. I guess what were your most common obstacles that you had faced in passing laws for Indigenous people, I guess, in your community area?
The biggest problem I believe we have are, and this is a tough one for me to understand, historical trauma broke up what we used to have, and the best explanation I had for it was what happened to Sitting Bull after his band surrendered to the cavalry, and Crazy Horse after what his band. Abraham Maslow, who some people connect to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, visited the Blackfoot Reservation for about 8 weeks before he was 30 years old. And he came up with his hierarchy observing the Navajo, or not the Blackfoot. Not until close to his end of life did he come out with the important principle he had of that he calls self-transcendence. The best explanation I have for self-transcendence is a book that was written by a business leader, and it's titled, if I remember correctly, Leaders Eat Last. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were self-transcendent leaders, but when Crazy Horse surrendered, he assumed an agricultural method of life. The agricultural method leads to land ownership, land control, and becoming self-centered. Sitting Bull, when he surrendered, did not adopt the agricultural way. So the contrast between Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse was that when Sitting Bull ended up going on tour with the Buffalo Bill show, he visited New York City. In his home country, after he surrendered, there were no hungry white people. They were all connected with the community, with whatever it was controlling the Indian populations, the forts, and the commerce that existed out there, plus the farms. But when he got to New York City, he saw homeless people laying in the streets who were hungry. He took his paycheck from the Buffalo Bill show and he donated it to those folk, while Crazy Horse was beginning to accumulate. Leaders don't accumulate, Santana. They enable everyone else to share in the benefits in ways that we have to consider all of our population. So if we have elders who are no longer capable of working, the resources should be there to care for them. And they were. When we lived multi-generation, we all took care of the elders. Now we have to have homes and things like that. We have to have conversations about how we're going to do these types of things. We solve them one problem at a time. And what I've discovered in policy work is that we don't think in systems. I'm trying to remember, I think it was Wendy who talked about silos. It might have been someone else, but we operate out of silos. When we are living in a dynamic system where our elders used to make sure that everyone was cared for, the children were well educated, they knew how to survive by the time they were 13, 14. I was 7 years old and I could go out and find a lot of different foods and I knew the names of them, and I could take a piece of wild celery and I knew when you could eat it and when you couldn't. So I peel off the skin that can burn you and put a little sugar, which I guess was our modern adaptation, on it and eat it. Those conversations should lead to the policies which are actually practices. When we enact them in law, all of a sudden, in a very rigid way, we go through and we have the administrative regulations, so everyone has to adhere to them. When we get down to the units that you are talking about, there is no reason why each unit cannot begin to move up towards policies that allow them to do things. One of the things that I thought would work well on the reservation is a dear friend of mine who's now walked into the forest brought a hydroponic grow system to the North Slope, extremely cold territory, and he actually had the funding to be able to put it together, and one of our tribes turned it down. It's not there because the tribe said no. I know the tribe that did that because their chairman, through historical trauma, was still a leader, but he was an alcoholic, and the other leader was an attorney, and yet they turned down this opportunity because they didn't have conversations about how it might work. There's a lot that we can come up with if we leave the flexibility to in the policy to smaller units, then they can be doing the experimentation to see if it works. So in the chat, Wendy mentioned a small biochar prototype using everyday materials to play. That's what's happening in Africa and Asia right now. The animal waste for many farmers, the biomass, is being used. It's called a pyrolysis converter. They're converting these things into synthetic fuel or biofuel. And instead of burning wood, they are using that. I did a project with some other wise people and found that 5% of deaths in these areas are attributed to burning wood. People die prematurely because they burn wood. When they begin to burn the synthetic fuel, it doesn't throw off the smoke that has caused problems in the health of a lot of these farmers. So these ideas are there, but when we begin to rigidly enforce them everywhere, that's when we lose control. The policy needs to be adaptable. The Indian Child Welfare Act was adaptable to each tribe. They could come up with how they wanted to care for their children. The problem we have in Alaska is that we don't have full authority, and the state hasn't allowed us to implement it. The other problem is we don't have foster homes. We can't get enough of our people to agree to take in children. There's an expense to it that you have to absorb, and it's very expensive, but there's no one to pay for the childcare, for the food, the clothing, the additional rent. There are foster care payments, but they're not sufficient to be able to do that. So individual problem solving is the way we need to go. When policies are rigid, they don't work. When they are flexible and you have a system in place like the business system for the Japanese, I use that system for everything. There are ways to solve problems in every arena, and you have to have those discussions in order to implement them. With healthcare, for example, in addition to the 500,000 we freed up for dental work, I studied Virginia Mason, and I tried to bring the system to the state of Alaska, to our tribal healthcare systems, we have problems getting doctors. One of the problems is that you make your doctors work from 7:30 in the morning till 8, 9 o'clock at night, 5 days a week. You force them to see so many patients, but you don't give them the resources. What Virginia Mason did is that they increased the number of patients a doctor could see. They gave them the time to do that. So they went from, I think it was 18 or 19 patients a day to 29 patients a day. And they were less stressed because of the improvements that happened. This is a complex area, Santana, that could be policy, but if you dictated like the government did that everyone adopt the system, they don't have an opportunity to learn and to implement it in a way that doesn't say, you got to do this. You let the people decide. The Virginia Mason example was introduced in a clinic that had 11 doctors and only one of them wanted to try it. The one that tried it, after they finished and implemented, was going home at 5:30. Everyone else is going home at 8:30 at night. Which one would you want to work in? That allows a doctor to make the decision. I hope that was partially responsive, but I believe it's going back to our indigenous way of place. We have to adapt to the place we are at. We have to have conversations so that we can all benefit from that adaptation, which is what we used to do.
Thank you, Patrick. I think Chief has some last words before Ray sends us on our way. Chief?
And you're on mute, Chief.
Chief,
You're still on mute.
Chief, you're on mute.
There you go.
Thank you for the presentation and all of you for the questions that you have and your comments. They're very helpful, and I'm sure there will be more conversation. But I just want to leave you with, from my perspective, what we're dealing with and what we got to think about. For years, we've been trying to get people to open up their minds. When I say that, I mean open up their minds so that they can see the wisdom of the elders. It's there. It's available. We just have to facilitate that. And how are we going to do that? And our experience, our observation is that the system that we are under, the imposed and the self-imposed system, has taken hold so much that we find ourselves maybe reluctant to talk to our neighbors and our matriarch, to talk to one another, to address the concerns and the problems that we have. This translational leadership is something that we, in our own way, have always known to exist in the elders. The elders have observed, have learned, have the wisdom to observe the environment, and they have learned from it through the stories and the lessons and their own participation in life. And the thing is, the modern world, they can explain what's happening, why things are the way they are. from this knowledge, this wisdom. They have their version of why things are the way they are and how things work. They know that. And what we're dealing with in our society is it almost always starts with land and our relationship to land. And what we have run into is the assertion that in the modern world, we need to develop. And it's usually couched in economic development. And we've gotten so many doors slammed on us by the assertion that communal ownership is a detriment to economic development. It stands in the way, and we got to change it. Look at the white world, see how they use land for economic development. That's the answer that we run up against. That's the assertion. And whereas the elders will say, the concept of ownership of a piece of land, a tract of land for your own economic purposes is contrary to the teachings. And so this has clashed in our experience on Navajo, and we haven't risen above it. And that's why we have to talk more among ourselves as to the basis for our society where our grandchildren will enjoy the blessings that we have enjoyed. And that's our responsibility. And I like the way that it's been interpreted and couched in these terms, translational leadership. And it helps in our conversation with the younger people who don't have the knowledge of the traditional language, but they do have command of the English language. So if you can combine the two, this is what translational leadership means in Navajo. We've had it, and we got to use it. And the answers that we've been given thus far hasn't worked. And we have to open up our mind because the wisdom of our elders demand that ability. So for the protection and the endurance of our posterity, the future generation. So I just wanted to leave that with you, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more conversation about going forward with these discussions. And I again thank all of you. Thank you.
I just want to thank everyone that attended. And we talk a lot about how it is that we want to go forward and explain the fundamental law in a real short way of explaining. I think this song that I leave everybody with explains what the Diné fundamental law is, or any indigenous society thinks in this way when they sing their prayers, and it comes from the minds of or people that they want to express themselves to the holy ones, to the Creator. So I want to leave you with this song. Nasta shemate jona ishetate yo veya bikeko hojona kona shana ana we yo we ho we weya naskoya hojona ko ke wit enole weya yo. Nasta shemate jona ishetate yo veya bikeko hojona kona shana ana we yo we ho we naskoya hojona ko ke wit and ole yo. Was a nice day. Was a nice day. Was a nice day. Was a nice day.
Ooh,
Thank you, Patrick.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
God is in our Percy.